Ethan Graves, a former U.S. Army veteran, thought the war was long behind him. All he wanted was quiet, the kind found in sea mist, rusted docks, and the steady rhythm of waves against the Oregon shore. His only companion was Rex, a loyal German shepherd who had stood by him through storms both on land and in spirit. When Ethan placed a winning bid on an abandoned shipping container, he believed it was nothing more than scrap metal, a harmless gamble to fill another empty day. But as the corroded doors creaked open, the smell of salt and secrets spilled into the air. Inside lay a forgotten world, a ship's recorder, a weathered journal, and a name erased from history. What began as curiosity soon turned into obsession, as Ethan realized he hadn't just bought a container. He had unearthed a buried promise, and some promises, once awakened, refused to sleep again. Please support us by subscribing to the channel, sharing this story, and helping keep the memory of courage, faith, and loyalty alive. The morning mist hung low over the Oregon docks, soft and silver, clinging to the cranes like cobwebs spun by the sea. Salt wind licked across rows of steel containers stacked like tired giants, their faded colors muted by years of storms and sun. A gull cried overhead, slicing the silence that often came before the auctioneer's voice. The crowd was small. Salvagers, junk dealers, a few men in overalls who smelled faintly of diesel and stale coffee. Among them stood Ethan Graves, a man whose stillness carried the weight of long distances. Ethan was 45, broad-shouldered and weathered, with skin bronzed by years under desert suns rather than coastal fog. His hair, dark brown streaked with gray, curled slightly at the nape where the rain hadn't reached. He wore a dark flannel shirt beneath a rugged Carhartt work jacket in classic warm tan-brown canvas, its edges faded and frayed by time. His jeans were pale, boots heavy with salt and dust. There was something in his stance, an economy of movement, the kind of man who saved energy not out of laziness, but because he'd once had to ration everything, even breath. His eyes, a worn shade of gray-blue, scanned the line of containers without any real intent, just a need to look at something solid. Beside him sat Rex, his German shepherd, 7 years old, coat sable black fading to gold along his chest and legs. The dog was alert but calm, tail flicking once when someone walked too close. His muzzle carried a dusting of white, the first quiet signs of age. Like Ethan, he didn't move unless there was reason. They were two creatures of the same kind, scarred, steady, and strangely patient with the world. The auctioneer was a port employee named Doug Halpern, a man in his late 50s with a voice that could cut through fog and stubborn steel. His belly strained against a faded orange vest, and he had a perpetual sunburn on his nose that spoke of decades spent under the wrong kind of light. "All right, folks," Doug barked, tapping his clipboard. "Next up, Unit B-47, unclaimed property, 10 years in storage. Contents unknown, sold as is, starting at 200. Ethan hadn't planned to bid on anything. He was there because sometimes, on restless days, he drove to places where people were still chasing lost things. It reminded him that searching wasn't always hopeless. He fingered the folded envelope in his pocket, the last of his veteran's payout, 12 crisp hundreds. Rent was due in 3 days, and he'd told himself he was only there to watch. But as Doug shouted, 200! Do I hear 250? Something made Ethan glance toward the last container in the row. It was green. No, not green exactly, but the bruised color of moss after a rain. The corners were rusted to orange, the paint flaking like sunburned skin. And, on the upper right corner, almost invisible beneath grime, were stenciled words half erased by salt and time. Flynn Storage. Personal. He didn't know the name, but the word personal struck him. Most containers were labeled with codes, numbers, or company names. Never that. Something about it felt kept, guarded. Rex let out a low, uncertain woof. Not fear, not excitement, just acknowledgement, as if to say, that one. Ethan exhaled slowly. He hadn't meant to raise his hand. But when Doug shouted, 900 anyone, going once, Ethan's arm lifted on its own. 1100 from bidder 42, Doug called. Ethan's pulse jumped. He hadn't even checked his number tag. 1150? Doug turned to the crowd. A man in a gray cap shook his head. 1150 going once, going twice. Ethan's voice came rough, unused. 1200. Sold. Doug slammed his clipboard. Unit B47 to bidder 42. $1,200 even. The sound echoed down the dock, sharp as a gunshot. Ethan lowered his arm, half in disbelief, half in resignation. Rex pressed his flank against Ethan's leg, sensing that peculiar mix of regret and calm that followed every decision his owner made. Ethan reached down, scratching behind the dog's ear. Guess we're in it now, boy. Doug shuffled over, wiping rain from his clipboard. You picked an odd one, he said. Been sitting there longer than most. Belonged to some fella named Flynn, I think. Storage fees never paid. Nobody ever claimed it after he passed. Passed? Ethan asked. Yeah, heart attack, maybe 3 years back. Old guy. Used to work in salvage, boats and such. Always had this one container full of God knows what. Family never showed. Doug shrugged. Might be junk, might be treasure. That's the gamble, huh? Ethan nodded. Gamble. The word tasted familiar. Once, in Afghanistan, he'd gambled every night. Not with money, but with chance, watching roads and rooftops, praying no wire waded under the sand. He'd come home alive but empty-handed, a survivor without a reason. He told himself this container was nothing but metal and dust, but deep down, he recognized the same itch that had driven him to sign up for the war in the first place. The hope that maybe, somewhere, something still mattered. He paid the clerk, signed the receipt, and followed Doug to the end of the dock. Unit B47 loomed taller than he expected. The lock was new, the hinges rusted. A pad of rainwater rested along the bottom lip, trembling in the wind. Doug gestured toward the seal. We'll cut her open for you once the paper's clear. Give it an hour. Ethan leaned against a nearby pile-in, watching waves slap the wooden posts below. Rex sat beside him, ears swiveling at each creak of chain and gull's cry. The air tasted of iron and fish. An old woman passed them, a port worker in a yellow slicker, hair white and thin as seafoam. She nodded politely, her cart full of discarded rope and glass buoys. You bought Flynn's box, she said, not as a question, but a statement. Yes, ma'am, Ethan replied. You knew him? Everyone knew Flynn, she said, voice soft, half lost to the wind. A strange man, lived alone by the pier, always talked about a ship that never came home, used to bring flowers to the water every March 17th. Ethan frowned. A memorial? Something like that. She smiled faintly. Said the sea owed him an answer. Guess he went looking for it. She wheeled her cart away before Ethan could ask more. An hour later, Doug returned with bolt cutters. "All right, soldier," he said, unaware of the irony. "Let's see what your 1,200 bought." The lock snapped clean. The hinges groaned as the doors swung wide, exhaling 10 years of stillness. Dust motes swirled in the weak sunlight. Inside, rows of wooden crates leaned like weary men. Bundles of maps and canvas tarps were tied with frayed rope. The smell hit first: salt, oil, paper, and a ghost of tobacco. Rex sniffed the threshold, then stepped back, tail low but wagging once. Ethan didn't move for a long time. He stared into the dim, cluttered space, feeling something heavy and quiet stir inside him. It wasn't greed or excitement. It was a recognition, like hearing the first notes of a song he'd forgotten but once loved. Doug cleared his throat. "Looks like old ship stuff. Instruments, maybe charts. Hard to tell. You can go through it here, or rent space for a few days." "I'll take the space," Ethan said without thinking. Doug nodded, scribbling on his clipboard. "Locker G12. You've got 72 hours. When Doug left, Ethan crouched beside the container door. The metal was cold, beaded with mist. He looked at the faint lettering again. Flynn Storage. Personal. And whispered, "Who were you, Flynn?" Rex tilted his head, ears perked, eyes sharp as if expecting an answer. The fog thickened around them, swallowing the dock in pale silence. Ethan locked the container and walked back toward his truck, hands deep in his jacket pockets. The gulls followed above, their cries fading with distance. He didn't look back. But as the tide rolled in, the waves struck the pylons in slow, deliberate rhythm. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats again, like a code only the sea could remember. And somewhere deep within that sound, something old had begun to stir. By noon, the fog had burned off, leaving a hard white glare over the docks. The gulls had retreated to the pilings, and the sea turned the color of beaten pewter. Ethan signed the short-term lease for the storage space. 3 days, 72 hours to decide what exactly he had spent his last $1,200 on. The clerk, a young woman with short hair dyed copper and eyes dulled by routine, barely looked up when he handed her the paper. "Locker G12, she said, stamping the form. "You'll need to return the key by Friday." Ethan nodded, pocketing the key without a word. Rex padded beside him, tongue lolling in the heat, his breath leaving faint clouds against the cold metal walls as they entered the storage row. The inside of Unit B47 was darker than before, the air still thick with the tang of salt and oil. Ethan propped the doors wide and dragged a wooden crate into the sunlight. Dust lifted like ghosts disturbed from sleep. Inside the crate, he found charts rolled tight with brittle rubber bands, signal lamps, and a half-broken brass compass housing, its glass cracked like a spider web. The instrument smelled faintly of tobacco and mildew, the scent of a life lived near the sea. He laid each item carefully on a tarp, sorting them by instinct, things worth saving, things worth selling, things he could not yet understand. He worked in silence, the kind that had become natural to him since leaving the army. After Afghanistan, silence was easier than small talk. He had spent years in noise, gunfire, rotors, shouting, until his body mistook quiet for danger. Now, years later, the absence of sound felt like something he could breathe. A voice broke the stillness. "You mind if I smoke while you dig through that?" Ethan turned. A man stood a few yards away, holding a pack of cigarettes and a coil of rope over one shoulder. He was in his early 60s, tall but slightly stooped with a narrow face carved by wind and time. His skin was pale under a week's worth of gray stubble, and his eyes, pale green and restless, darted around as if measuring every object. He wore a faded navy jacket with Port Authority stitched above the pocket. "Don't mind," Ethan said. The man struck a match, cupping it against the breeze. "Name's Frank Dillard. Used to know Flynn, the fella who owned this box. Hell of a guy. A little crazy, maybe, but all of us working salvage get that way." Ethan nodded, curious but cautious. "You worked with him?" Frank exhaled smoke, the line of his mouth curling in half a smile. "Worked near him. He was a diver back when the bay was still busy. Spent his life chasing shipwrecks. Said there was one he could never forget. Used to come here every month to check this container. Never opened it while anyone was watching." Rex wandered forward, sniffing Frank's boots before giving a low approving rumble. The old man reached down, rubbing the dog's head. "Good soldier," he murmured. "Same as his owner," Ethan said quietly. Frank squinted. "You, Army?" Ethan gave a slow nod. "Retired. Long time ago?" "Then you understand Flynn more than you think," Frank said. "Some men fight wars on land, some at sea. Either way, they come home with ghosts they can't shake." He flicked ash onto the gravel. "Flynn's ghost had a name. Blue Wren." Ethan felt a small pulse at the base of his throat. "Blue Wren? Ship went down in '84. Official story was bad weather and bad leadership. Lot of folks said the captain bailed early. Flynn never bought it. Spent the rest of his days proving the man died trying to save his crew. Said the sea was lying. Did he ever prove it?" Frank shrugged. "If he did, he didn't tell nobody. He just stopped showing up one day. Heard he passed alone. Shame, really." He stubbed out the cigarette on the steel door, leaving a black circle. "If you find something in there that tells his story, maybe give it to someone who'll care. Man deserved at least that much." Ethan didn't answer. Frank gave Rex one last pat and walked off toward the waterfront, the sound of his boots fading under the clatter of chains and gulls. Ethan turned back to the container. His hands were trembling, not from fear but a peculiar excitement, the kind that came when a soldier realized the map wasn't random after all. He searched the back wall, tracing his fingers over a set of old wooden shelves. One of them wobbled oddly. Rex's ears pricked up. The dog sniffed along the base, then pawed once, claws clicking against something hollow. Ethan crouched, rapped his knuckles on the floor. The sound was wrong, a soft drum, not solid steel. "Good boy," he murmured. He pulled a wrench from his pack and began prying at the panel. The wood gave way reluctantly, splintering with a muted crack. Beneath it lay a small recessed compartment, wrapped in the plastic sheeting to protect from moisture. Inside, 3 objects rested side by side like offerings. The first was a mechanical voyage recorder, roughly the size of a shoebox, its metal casing dulled with oxidation, but the engraving still clear. Blue Wren, 1984. A coil of magnetic tape peeked from the cracked seal. The second was a leather-bound journal, the cover darkened by water stains, but the clasp still intact. A small brass plate read S. Briggs. The third was a ship model, handmade from black wood and copper wire, small enough to cradle in 2 hands. The craftsmanship was stunning. Every line, every sail, perfect. Ethan turned it over and found a faint carving at the base. For E. Briggs. He exhaled. "Rex, what the hell have we walked into?" The dog thumped his tail once, eyes steady. Ethan sat back on the crate, the journal heavy in his palms. He opened it to the first page, and the scent of salt and leather rose like breath from the past. The handwriting inside was tight, deliberate. The ink, faded but legible. March 17th, 1984. The storm came faster than forecast. We lost the main engine 2 hours ago. The captain refuses to abandon ship. I believe him. He says no man left behind. If anyone finds this, know we did not run. Ethan closed the book, his chest tight. The edges of the page had crumbled against his thumb. Time trying to erase what was written, as if even memory had to rot eventually. He looked at the recorder again, its silence more haunting than any noise. In the far corner of the compartment lay a photograph sealed in a Ziploc bag. Inside, a bearded man with silver hair stood beside a half-sunken vessel, his arm raised in weary triumph. Scrawled beneath in faded pen were the words, "Harold Flynn, the one who kept searching." Ethan studied the face. The lines were deep, eyes tired but alive with purpose. Flynn looked like a man who had spent too long listening to the ocean and finally decided to answer back. He sat there for a while, the hum of the port filling the silence. Outside, a freighter horn bellowed low, rolling across the bay like thunder. Rex laid his head on Ethan's boot, sighing, that low, human sound dogs make when the world feels too big. Ethan wiped dust from his hands, then gently rewrapped the objects. "We'll come back tomorrow," he told Rex, "before someone decides this junk's worth stealing." He locked the container, checked the handle twice, then leaned his forehead against the cold steel. Somewhere in the sound of the distant machinery and gull cries, he thought he could hear the faint echo of waves against a hull, the sea murmuring secrets through a man's unfinished promise. He whispered, "You kept searching, Flynn. Let's see what you left behind." The night settled over the Oregon coast like a heavy blanket of fog, the kind that muffled the world into silence. Ethan sat at the small wooden table in his rented cabin on the outskirts of Astoria, a dim lamp throwing a cone of amber light across the journal. Outside, the rhythmic crash of waves blended with the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Rex lay curled near the door, paws twitching as he dreamed, the occasional huff rising from his chest. The journal rested in front of Ethan like something alive. Its leather cover, cracked and salt-stained, seemed to pulse faintly in the lamplight. He hesitated before opening it again, as though afraid the words inside might see through him. The first page had already changed everything. March 17th, 1984. The ship is listing. Water in the engine room. If anyone finds this, tell them we did not abandon anyone. Beneath the scrawled signature, Samuel Briggs, Chief Engineer. That name had followed him all day, looping in his thoughts like an echo. Ethan turned the page carefully. The next entries were shorter, sentences slanting across the paper as the handwriting deteriorated, the ink blurring into desperation. The last line before the ink stopped entirely read, "Captain says we hold course east. The storm's wrong. The compass spins." Ethan leaned back, exhaling through his teeth. The words carried that cold ring of truth only those who had faced death understood. He'd seen men write similar lines on the battlefield, final notes scribbled on ration boxes or the backs of photographs. When the journal changed handwriting halfway through, Ethan noticed it immediately. The new script was neater, slower, written years later by someone who had survived. "I found their log today," it began. "I promised Briggs I would bring back their truth. I will keep looking until the sea gives it up." The entry was signed Harold Flynn, 1992. Flynn's tone across the later pages was obsessive but not unhinged. Each paragraph documented new leads, coordinates, salvage expeditions, arguments with maritime boards, and personal losses. A man consumed by a promise. Ethan felt the strange pull of recognition. He, too, had lived years defined by promises he couldn't keep. Names of men lost in the desert. Faces that resurfaced at night when the wind moved just right. Flynn, in a different way, had fought the same ghost. Rex shifted, ears flicking as if he sensed Ethan's unrest. The dog rose, stretched, and padded over to rest his head on Ethan's thigh. Ethan smiled faintly, running his rough fingers through Rex's sable coat. "You'd have liked Flynn," he muttered. "He didn't quit either." Curiosity overtook fatigue. He opened his laptop, a battered gray machine missing 2 keys, and began to type Blue Wren 1984 shipwreck into the search bar. The internet offered a trickle of forgotten history. A cargo vessel lost off the California coast, presumed sunk in a storm. Official cause: mechanical failure and captain's negligence. No survivors, no recovery. The captain's name: William Mercer. Ethan frowned. He kept scrolling through news archives, finding a few grainy black and white photos of the ship and a single interview from 1985 with a Coast Guard spokesman calling it an unfortunate but closed case. Yet, buried deep in a maritime forum thread, he found a comment from a user named HF Salvage, dated 2004. The Wren didn't die the way they said. Engines were sabotaged. Evidence is still out there. Someone needs to look. HF? Ethan murmured. Harold Flynn. The digital trail fit too neatly. An old man fighting to correct an official lie. Ethan leaned back, rubbing his temples. He could almost picture Flynn, a solitary figure hunched over a desk much like this one. Papers spread across every surface, salt-streaked hair and tired eyes fixed on maps that never quite told the truth. A knock startled him. It was late, nearly midnight. Rex's ears shot up, his body tense but silent. Ethan moved to the door cautiously, his hand instinctively brushing the pocket knife clipped inside his jacket. He opened it to find a woman standing in the porch light's amber glow, a thermos in one hand and a paper envelope in the other. "Evening," she said, her voice steady, carrying the faint rasp of someone who smoked or laughed too much. Maybe both. Ethan recognized her after a moment. Helen Dorsey, the property manager of the marina storage lots. Mid-40s, tall and lean with short black hair streaked silver and the weathered, freckled skin of a lifelong coastal resident. She was practical, unhurried, and spoke the way people did when they'd seen too many things to be impressed anymore. "Sorry to bother you," Helen said. "Doug Halpern mentioned you rented Flynn's old unit. Thought you should have this." She handed him the envelope. Came across it when clearing the office files. He must have left it with his payment records before he passed. Ethan took the envelope, feeling its surprising weight. "You knew him?" Helen leaned against the porch railing. "Not well. He'd come by with those big canvas bags full of maps and notebooks. Always polite, always tired, lived out by the lighthouse road. Folks said he'd been some kind of rescue diver before the Navy downsized. After that, he did odd jobs and salvage, kept mostly to himself." She looked past Ethan toward the dark sea. "Used to tell me the water owed him an answer. I never asked what that meant." Ethan nodded. "I think I'm starting to find out." Helen smiled faintly. "Just be careful, Mr. Graves. Men who stare too long into old stories tend to disappear into them." She patted Rex's head. The dog didn't flinch, which said something, then left down the gravel path. Inside, Ethan opened the envelope. Inside were 3 items. A folded map of the California coastline, marked with red X's, a business card for Oregon Coastal Archives, Dr. Leland Mercer, and a small rusted key labeled Cottage 14. He unfolded the map. Each X corresponded to a date written beside it: 1987, 1990, 1998. Flynn's salvage dives. Near the final one, scrawled in ink that bled through the paper, was a note. He wasn't running, he was saving them. The name on the business card made Ethan pause. Mercer. The same as the captain's. Could Dr. Leland Mercer be related? He powered his laptop again and searched the name. A brief biography appeared. Dr. Leland Mercer, maritime historian, Oregon Coastal Archives. Born 1958, San Diego. Son of Captain William Mercer. Blue Wren, 1984. Ethan sat back, stunned. Flynn hadn't just chased a wreck. He'd chased a man's redemption, and now that man's son was still alive. The story was looping through generations, anchored by guilt and obsession. He traced the inked words on the map again, whispering, "He wasn't running." Rex whined softly, as if sensing Ethan's growing resolve. "Yeah," Ethan said, "I know what you're thinking." He folded the map carefully, slid the key into his pocket, and glanced at the journal once more. Flynn had promised Briggs he would find the truth. Now that promise had somehow fallen into Ethan's hands. He doused the lamp, sat in the darkness for a while, listening to the distant surf. The cabin walls creaked as if shifting with the tide. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a direction. Not peace, but purpose. When dawn crept gray and cold through the blinds, he loaded his truck with the container artifacts: the recorder, the model ship, and the journal wrapped in cloth. Rex jumped into the passenger seat without waiting for command. Ethan turned the ignition. The engine coughed awake, shaking dust from its bones. As they pulled onto the coastal road, the mist lifted in slow veils, revealing the far stretch of water where the Blue Wren had vanished 4 decades earlier. The ocean looked calm that morning, deceitfully calm, like something pretending to sleep. Ethan gripped the wheel tighter. "You kept your promise, Flynn," he murmured. "Let's see if I can keep mine." Morning came cold and colorless, the kind of gray that blurred the line between sea and sky. Ethan's truck rumbled down the narrow coastal road, the model ship and the recorder strapped carefully lay in the passenger seat beside Rex. The dog sat upright, watching the passing shoreline with quiet alertness, as though he, too, sensed they were carrying something sacred. Ethan's eyes were shadowed from a sleepless night. Flynn's map, now spread across the dashboard, was marked with red circles like wounds along the Pacific coast. His destination this morning wasn't one of them. It was the small Coast Guard restoration lab where his old friend worked. The lab stood at the edge of the Astoria base, a squat building of gray concrete and humming fluorescent lights. Inside, machines clicked and whirred beneath the faint smell of oil and ozone. Behind a desk cluttered with circuit boards and mugs of cold coffee sat Chief Technician Alan Reyes, a man of 50, short and stocky, with the compact power of someone who had spent a lifetime hauling engines apart and putting them back together. His hair was close-cropped, silver streaks running through black, and a faint burn scar curved across his left cheek, a souvenir from a shipboard explosion in the early 90s. He wore his Coast Guard uniform half unbuttoned and his expression in a perpetual squint, as if trying to see through time and machinery both. When Ethan walked in carrying the box, Alan looked up startled. "Well, I'll be damned. Ethan Graves, in the flesh. Thought you'd disappeared to Montana or something." Ethan grinned faintly. "Tried that once. The mountains got tired of me." Alan's laugh was short, genuine. "You always did have that effect on places." He gestured at the metal case. "What's this? Looks older than both of us." Ethan set it gently on the table. "A mechanical voyage recorder. Found it in an auctioned container that used to belong to a salvage diver, Harold Flynn. Ever heard of him?" Alan's brow furrowed. "Flynn. Yeah, the guy who used to haunt the marina, always talking about some wreck off the California coast. Blue something." "Blue Wren," Ethan said. "He spent years trying to prove her captain wasn't a coward. I think this thing might do that." Alan leaned closer, wiping his hands on a rag. "Well, if it's got any life left in it, I'll find it. No promises, though. These old analog recorders don't like sitting still for decades." He pried open the casing, revealing the magnetic spools and brass components inside. The faint smell of brine rose from the corroded edges. "Hell, this thing's practically mummified," he muttered, half in admiration. As Alan worked, Ethan watched in silence, occasionally glancing at Rex, who waited patiently near the door. The rhythmic hum of equipment filled the air. Alan's hands moved with precision, his movements confident and steady, a man who had rebuilt more than machines in his time. "You remember when we pulled that trawler up off Cape Flattery?" Alan asked suddenly. 50 feet under, engines locked, whole crew gone. You stayed topside in the rain for 8 hours waiting for word." Ethan nodded slowly. "I remember. We found their dog tags in a jar." Alan grunted softly. "Yeah, that was the day I realized you never quit on the dead." He smiled faintly. "Guess that hasn't changed." Hours passed. Alan cleaned the tape heads, replaced a fuse, and threaded the fragile reels into a playback unit connected to his monitor. When he finally flipped the switch, static filled the room. Then a faint, rhythmic pulse. Beep, pause, beep, beep. The signal pattern sharpened. Ethan felt his throat tighten. Alan adjusted a dial. "That's an emergency broadcast frequency." "Wait." It's voice-coded. Through layers of distortion, a human voice emerged, fractured by time. "This is the Blue Wren. Engines failing. Captain orders all hands to stand fast. Repeat, no abandonment." The message cut, then resumed faintly. "Captain Mercer attempting to stabilize ballast. Repeat, not abandoning crew." Alan froze. Holy hell. The final sound was the ocean, roaring through the static like breath through a grave. Then silence. Ethan sat motionless, jaw clenched. He had heard countless distress calls in his life, but this one carried a strange grace. A man refusing to leave his crew, his voice steady even as the sea swallowed him. Alan leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "That recording's a miracle, Ethan. It completely contradicts the Coast Guard's official report. If this got buried, someone wanted it that way." "Flynn knew," Ethan said quietly. "He spent decades trying to get someone to listen." Alan eyed him carefully. "What are you planning to do?" Ethan reached for the recorder, his voice low. "Finish what he started." Alan sighed, rubbing his forehead. You're going to dig into old wounds, brother. The kind that don't heal easy. Neither do I, Ethan said, managing a faint smile. Before leaving, Alan transferred the audio files to a flash drive and sealed the recorder in a protective case. You'll need help to get this heard officially, he said. Try the Maritime Museum. They keep archives on old wrecks. Talk to a woman named Marion Holbrook. She's a curator there, sharp as hell, probably knows every missing ship in the last 50 years. The museum sat on the southern edge of the harbor, a weathered brick building with tall windows and banners of faded blue silk. Inside, the scent of old wood and sea rope filled the air. Display cases lined the walls, each one a quiet elegy to lost voyages. Behind the reception counter stood Marion Holbrook, mid-50s, with auburn hair streaked white at the temples and reading glasses perched halfway down her nose. Her posture was precise, shoulders straight as though discipline was something she wore rather than practiced. Years of cataloging grief had not made her cold. Her eyes, green and sharp, carried an unspoken empathy. When Ethan introduced himself and mentioned Flynn, Marion's expression softened. Harold Flynn, yes, I remember him. He came here often, promised to donate several artifacts from the Blue Wren once his research was complete. We never received them. He died the following winter, heart failure. We tried to locate his storage items but never could. Ethan placed the recorder and Flynn's journal on the counter. You can stop looking. I found them. Marion adjusted her glasses, peering at the recorder. My God, that's the original voyage data unit. We thought it lost. Alan's audio file played through her office speakers, the captain's final message filling the air like a ghost finally given voice. Marion sat back, eyes glistening. He stayed. He tried to save them. Ethan nodded. Flynn was right all along. Marion exhaled slowly. This changes everything. The museum will petition to reopen the official case files. You understand, of course, there will be press, verification teams, maybe even hearings. Ethan looked out the window where gulls wheeled above the harbor. I don't care about that. I just want them remembered right. Marion gave him a look that was both professional and deeply human. Flynn would have liked you. He said once, it'll take another soldier to finish what I started. Maybe he wasn't wrong. As Ethan turned to leave, Marion called out, Mr. Graves, when we hold the re-exhibition, I want you there. You and whoever carries Flynn's legacy now. Ethan smiled faintly. I think he's already here. He nodded toward Rex, who wagged his tail once. Outside, the tide was rising, the water gleaming silver under the afternoon sun. Ethan stood at the edge of the pier, wind tugging at his jacket. For the first time in years, the air felt lighter. Not because the burden had lifted, but because it had meaning. Somewhere, Flynn's promise had found its way home. The road to Cape Mendocino wound along cliffs that fell sheer into the Pacific, the ocean below rolling and glimmering like hammered steel. The air smelled of salt and pine, and gulls circled the distant coves where shipwrecks once rested. Ethan drove slowly, his truck heavy with relics of the past. The journal, the voyage recorder, the small wooden model of Blue Wren. Beside him, Rex sat alert, his head slightly out the window, nose twitching in the wind. He was aging now, gray threading through his muzzle, but his eyes still burned bright, always searching. According to the note in Flynn's journal, the address belonged to Eleanor Briggs, the daughter of the Blue Wren's chief engineer. Ethan followed the coastal road until he reached a narrow turnoff leading to a bluffside lane lined with cypress trees bent by the wind. At the end stood a small white cottage, its paint peeling, its porch wrapped with wild roses fighting to bloom in the salt air. The sound of the waves echoed against the rocks below, a low, eternal breathing. He parked, stepping out into the wind. Rex leapt down after him, shaking the salt from his fur. Ethan knocked on the door. It opened after a long pause. The woman who appeared was in her early 50s, tall and slender, with a presence both strong and tired in equal measure. Her hair was silver blonde, braided loosely down one shoulder, and her skin bore the soft weathering of someone who lived near the sea, sun freckles, faint wrinkles shaped by wind and salt. Her eyes, a deep green-gray, studied Ethan with a calm skepticism that reminded him of a lighthouse watching for intruders. She wore a blue wool sweater over faded jeans, her hands flecked with paint. "Yes?" she asked, her voice low and even, the voice of someone who didn't rush to fill silence. "Miss Briggs?" Ethan said. "My name's Ethan Graves. I think I have something that belongs to you, or to your father." Her expression didn't change, but she opened the door wider. "You'd better come in, then." The cottage smelled of linseed oil and coffee. Paintings filled every wall, stormy seascapes, each with a ship struggling against monstrous waves. Some were beautiful, others chaotic, but all seemed to share the same ghost, the shape of a small vessel battling to stay afloat. Ethan glanced around as she motioned him toward a chair. "You painted these?" Eleanor nodded. "It's what I do now. The sea doesn't pay well, but it doesn't lie." She folded her arms, watching him. "Now tell me what this is about." Ethan placed the journal and the photo of Harold Flynn on the table alongside the recorder. "I found these inside a storage container. It belonged to a man named Flynn, a salvage diver. He spent his life searching for your father's ship, the Blue Wren. I think he found proof that your father and the crew tried to save her." Eleanor froze. Her hand hovered over the photograph before she finally picked it up. The air seemed to thin around them. "Harold Flynn," she whispered. "I remember that name." She went to a small cabinet and returned with an old letter, yellowed at the edges, the envelope fragile. She handed it to Ethan. "My mother kept this until she died. It came from a man named Flynn, dated 1985. He said he'd found pieces of the wreck, that he believed the official story was wrong. He wrote that he'd keep searching until the sea gives back its truth." Ethan's throat tightened. The phrasing was almost identical to the note Flynn had written in the journal's final page. Eleanor set the photo beside the letter and exhaled softly, eyes wet but steady. "My father wasn't a coward. He wouldn't have left his crew." Ethan nodded. "I know. We've recovered part of the recorder. It captured the captain's final message. He stayed. They all did." For a long time, Eleanor said nothing. The wind pushed at the windows, and somewhere outside a wind chime made from shells clattered softly. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed, quieter but deeper. "For 40 years, people looked at me with pity. Children at school whispered that my father ran. Even after I grew up, that story followed me like a shadow." She turned toward the sea-facing window, her reflection pale in the glass. "You have no ideas what it's like to live waiting for the ocean to apologize." Ethan said, "Maybe I do." She glanced at him, curious. He hesitated before continuing. "I was a soldier. I came back when others didn't. Some of the stories they told about those missions weren't true either. So I learned that if the truth matters, you go find it yourself." Eleanor smiled faintly, a small crack in her composure. "Then you understand him, my father, and maybe Flynn, too." She sat, tracing the edges of the photo. I used to dream that the sea would tell me what happened, that one night I'd hear knocking on the door and it'd be someone from the crew. I painted because it was the only way to make the silence answer back. Ethan placed the model of the blue Wren on the table. The candlelight flickered across its miniature deck, the copper wire rigging glinting faintly. Eleanor reached out, touching it like she might a living thing. "He built this?" she asked. "Flynn did," Ethan said. "I think it was his way of remembering your father's work." Her eyes softened. "He must have cared a lot." "He did," Ethan said quietly. "He never stopped searching. Neither should we." Eleanor looked out the window again, where the sea darkened under gathering clouds. "What do you want to do?" "Bring this to the Oregon Maritime Museum. They've agreed to reopen the case. The recorder, the journal, the model, it all belongs there, with your father's name cleared." She nodded slowly. "Then I'll come with you." For the first time in years, Ethan felt something shift inside him, like a tide turning. Not relief, not joy, but connection. Flynn's long vigil had crossed into theirs, a bridge built between the living and the dead. They drove back toward Oregon the next morning. The weather had changed. The sky was streaked with violet clouds, and sunlight broke through in fragile columns. Rex rode in the back seat, occasionally resting his chin on Eleanor's shoulder as though adopting her into the pack. She smiled, her hand brushing the dog's head. As they approached the museum, the sea wind rose again. Eleanor looked out toward the horizon, her voice quiet but certain. "My father used to say the ocean keeps everything it loves, but when it's ready, it returns what's truly meant to be found." Ethan met her gaze and nodded. "Maybe that's what this is." At the museum's front steps, Marion Holbrook waited, her coat snapping in the wind. When she saw the two approaching, she smiled, gentle, solemn, as though she understood without words what this moment meant. Together, they carried the artifacts inside. By the following week, Ethan's story had drifted across the coastal towns like sea mist. What began as a quiet museum submission became a headline in the Oregon Chronicle. "Veteran buys forgotten container. Uncovers truth about 1984 shipwreck." The photograph beneath showed Ethan in his tan Carhartt jacket, the blue Wren model in his hands, Rex sitting loyally at his feet. The caption read, "A soldier's promise to finish another man's search." He hadn't wanted attention, but truth, once freed, was never a quiet guest. Calls came from journalists, maritime historians, even old divers who claimed they'd known Flynn. Ethan ignored most of them. He spent his mornings walking the beach with Rex and Eleanor, who had begun helping Marion Holbrook prepare the exhibit at the museum. Eleanor moved with new purpose. Her grief, long muted, had found somewhere to go. Sometimes she would stand before the sea and paint, her strokes no longer wild with sorrow but careful, deliberate, alive. But fame brings shadows, and in the shadows some things stirred. At a small cafe near the docks, a man in a pinstripe coat sat reading the same newspaper article. His name was Charles H. Loring, 67, tall but stooped from years at a desk. He had a narrow face, clean-shaven, with thin lips and eyes the color of smoke. His hair, once black, was silvered, parted precisely even in the coastal wind. He had once been a claims investigator for Blue Maritime Insurance, the company responsible for handling the Blue Wren disaster in 1984. He had signed the final report, the one that declared captain error and abandonment of crew. Loring's career had ended quietly a decade ago. Early retirement, they called it, though whispers of irregularities followed him. He'd built a comfortable life inland, far from the sea, but this headline drew him back like a guilty tide. He folded the paper, his fingers trembling slightly. "Damn you, Flynn," he muttered. "You just couldn't stay buried." That evening, rain began to fall over Astoria. Ethan returned home from the museum, tired but content. The exhibition date was set. The blue Wren artifacts would soon be unveiled alongside Flynn's story. He fed Rex, made coffee, and sat at his desk to write a letter to Marion, confirming the display details. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling against the eaves. The sound of the storm reminded him of that old SOS recording, the captain's voice steady in chaos. He smiled faintly. Then Hex growled. It was a low, guttural sound that came from deep in his chest, the kind he made only when danger was close. Ethan stood, listening. Through the storm's howl, a faint metallic clink echoed, the unmistakable sound of a lock being tampered with. He reached for the flashlight and his old service pistol from the drawer, the weight of it familiar but unwelcome in his hand. "Stay," he whispered to Rex, though the dog was already poised, muscles tense, eyes fixed on the back door. A second later, the latch gave way. A shadow slipped inside, rain dripping from a long coat. The man moved quickly, scanning the room until the beam of Ethan's flashlight froze him mid-step. "Don't move," Ethan said, voice calm but iron-edged. The intruder turned, a thin, pale man with deep creases around his mouth, eyes tired and wary. His right hand held a crowbar, his left a folder of papers clutched to his chest. The flashlight revealed his face, Charles Loring. "Who are you?" Ethan demanded. "I'm the man who wrote the lies your friend's been trying to bury for 40 years, Loring rasped. His voice had the tremor of guilt long bottled up. "Flynn should have left well enough alone." Rex stepped forward, teeth bared. Loring flinched. "Call off the dog. I didn't come here to hurt anyone." "Then why break into my house?" Loring's eyes darted toward the recorder case on the table. "To stop that from going public. You don't understand. Those reports, that captain, the whole damn case, it wasn't just me. There were people higher up, investors. If this story spreads, they'll ruin what's left of me." Ethan's tone sharpened. "So you destroyed evidence to protect your career?" Loring's shoulders sagged. "I was young. They said the ship's engines had failed because of poor maintenance, but the logs showed sabotage. Someone had altered the parts before departure. If the truth came out, Blue Maritime would have owed millions. So they buried it. I buried it. And Flynn, he wouldn't stop. He kept sending letters, files, threatening to expose it. I warned him once, told him to let it go." "Warned him?" Ethan repeated. Loring's eyes flickered. "He got threats, accidents. Maybe I didn't stop them. Maybe I didn't try hard enough." The silence that followed was heavy. The storm outside raged harder, hammering the roof. Ethan felt anger stir inside him, but beneath it, pity too. Pity for a man who'd traded truth for comfort and been haunted by both. Before he could answer, blue lights flashed outside. The police. Someone, perhaps a neighbor, had seen the break-in. Loring looked toward the window, panic flickering in his face. "Don't run," Ethan said quietly, but the old habits of guilt die hard. Loring bolted for the door, slipping on the wet floor. Rex lunged forward, barking sharply, stopping him in his tracks. Within seconds, 2 officers entered, weapons drawn. They pinned Lauren to the ground, the folder scattering papers across the floor. Ethan recognized the letterhead. Blue Maritime Insurance, 1984 Incident Report. After statements were given, one of the officers, Sergeant Blake Turner, a burly man in his late 30s with a trimmed beard and steady voice, nodded at Ethan. "You're lucky your dog's quick. This guy had a car trunk full of forged documents, probably meant to swap them with whatever you've got." Ethan glanced toward the recorder case. "He won't get the chance." As they led Loring away, the man turned once, rain dripping from his face. "You think you've set things right," he said bitterly, "but you've just stirred the sea again. The truth never comes without a cost." Ethan watched him go, the words lingering. Rex pressed against his leg, whining softly. "Yeah," Ethan murmured. "Flynn probably heard the same thing." The next morning, the story broke again, this time nationwide. The police report linked the break-in to the reopened investigation of Blue Maritime's historical fraud. The Coast Guard verified the recorder's authenticity, confirming that the Blue Wren crew had remained aboard until the end. Official statements cleared Captain Mercer and the entire crew of wrongdoing. At the museum, Marion Holbrook called Ethan. "It's done," she said, voice thick with emotion. "They've reinstated every name. 41 years late, but they'll finally be remembered as heroes." Eleanor stood beside Ethan when he ended the call. She was painting again, a new canvas before her. No storms this time, only a calm horizon with faint morning light breaking through. "He did it," she whispered. "Flynn did it. Through you." Ethan looked out toward the gray water where gulls dipped between waves. "He didn't stop searching," he said softly, "and neither did we." The tide below swelled, pushing against the rocks with the steady rhythm of memory. In the wind's sigh, it almost sounded like applause, quiet, endless, grateful. 2 years passed, though the Oregon coast seemed unchanged. The same restless waves, the same gray fog clinging to the cliffs like memory that refused to fade. Yet, to Ethan, everything felt different. The sea no longer sounded like silence. It sounded like a story finished at last. The wind carried not loneliness, but the echo of a promise kept. He stood now on the same beach where Flynn's had once left flowers each March 17th. Only this time, the tide had gone out far enough to reveal the smooth stones beneath the sand, glistening like small secrets in the morning light. The memorial had been simple by design. Flynn would have wanted it that way. A single stone marker, carved from local basalt, rested at the foot of the dunes. The letters were clean and unadorned, the work of a craftsman who understood reverence through restraint. In memory of the crew of Blue Wren and Harold Flynn, the man who never stopped searching. Ethan wore his old Carhartt tan-brown jacket, now even more faded from the sun and salt, the seams softened by years of wind. Beside him, Rex lay still, his muzzle almost entirely gray now. He was slower these days, but his gaze never lost that quiet intelligence, as though he understood this moment belonged to both of them. The dog's ears flicked in rhythm with the sea breeze, eyes tracking the gulls that circled lazily above. Eleanor Briggs stood before the stone, her hair swept back by the wind. She looked stronger than she had 2 years ago. Her face carried peace where sorrow once lived. The soft lines at the corners of her eyes had deepened, but so had her calm. She held a bouquet of sea lavender and white lilies, bound with a strip of navy ribbon, Flynn's old diving color, Marion had told her. As Eleanor knelt to place the flowers against the stone, her voice trembled softly in the wind. "You found them. Harold. You brought them home." Nearby, Marion Holbrook adjusted a small plaque that listed the names of the Blue Wren's crew. Her once auburn hair had turned more silver since Ethan last saw her, but her precision and quiet strength remained unchanged. She straightened, dusting sand from her hands. "It's a good turnout," she said softly to Ethan. "More than 30 people from the town came, even a few of the old Coast Guard divers. You'd have liked Flynn's face if he could see this." Ethan smiled faintly. "He probably would have complained about the lettering." Marion chuckled, her voice low. "Probably, but then he'd have cried when no one was watching." She gave him a look of quiet pride. "You've done more than finish what he started. You gave back a piece of history no one thought mattered anymore." Before Ethan could reply, a boy of about 12 ran up the dunes, carrying a folded flag. His name was Tommy Halpern, Doug's grandson, the same Doug who had auctioned off Flynn's container years ago. The boy had bright eyes, freckles, and the fearless enthusiasm of youth. He saluted awkwardly. "Mr. Graves, sir," he said. "My grandpa says this was the flag they used when they raised the old Coast Guard station. He wanted it here today." Ethan took the flag gently, nodding. "Tell your grandpa thank you, Tommy, and thank you for bringing it." The boy grinned before sprinting back toward the crowd. Eleanor watched him go. "It's strange," she murmured, "how everything circles back. The man who sold Flynn's box gave us this flag." "That's the sea for you," Ethan said. "It never throws anything away. It just waits until the tide's right." As the ceremony began, Marion spoke briefly to the gathered crowd. Her words were measured, dignified. "History remembers the lost," she said, "but sometimes it forgets the ones who searched for them. Today we remember both. The crew of Blue Wren, who faced the sea with courage, and Harold Flynn, who gave his life to tell their truth. Because of them, this coast carries not tragedy, but honor." When she finished, the wind seemed to pause, as if the sea itself were listening. Then the waves broke gently across the sand, and the sound rolled through the crowd like a sigh of relief. After the ceremony, most people drifted away, their conversations fading into the rhythm of the tide. Ethan lingered. He placed his hand on the rough surface of the stone, the chill seeping into his palm. "Rest easy, Flynn," he said quietly. "We kept your word." Eleanor joined him. "He'd be proud of you, Ethan. Of both of you," she added, looking down at Rex, who had begun to doze beside the flowers. "You never stopped searching either." He shook his head, smiling faintly. "Flynn did the hard part. I just followed the trail." Later that afternoon, when the sky turned gold, they walked together along the shoreline. The waves lapped at their boots, leaving foam that glittered before vanishing. Eleanor carried her sketchbook, stopping now and then to capture a line of light or the arc of a gull's wings. She'd begun painting again, new subjects this time. Quiet beaches, weathered faces, dogs beside veterans. Ethan had changed too. With what little money he had saved from selling scrap in the museum's small honorarium, he'd started a nonprofit called Waves and Warriors. It wasn't grand, just a converted boathouse on the edge of town, but it served as a sanctuary for veterans struggling with PTSD. They worked with rescue dogs, teaching them obedience and companionship, finding healing in the steady rhythm of training in the salt air. Rex, though aging, had become the program's heart. New arrivals always met him first, and somehow even the most closed-off men opened up after sitting quietly beside the old shepherd. Ethan often said that Rex understood more about grief and redemption than most people ever could. One evening, a young Marine named Caleb Ortiz joined the program. 29, tall and lean, with close-cropped black hair and a long scar tracing down his right arm. His brown eyes were wary, hollowed by years overseas. He barely spoke at first, but over time, the silence between him and Rex turned into something like trust. Watching them, Ethan felt a deep peace settle over him. The circle was complete. The dog that had once guided him through loss was now guiding others. Now, standing again on the beach as the sun sank, Ethan looked toward the horizon. The sky blazed orange and rose, reflected in the water like liquid fire. "You know," he said to Eleanor, "Flynn used to say the sea keeps its own kind of memory. It never forgets the ones who listen." She smiled. "Then it remembers you too." He didn't answer right away. The wind tugged at his jacket, the gulls crying somewhere above. Finally, he said, almost to himself, "Some promises don't need witnesses, just someone willing to keep them." As dusk deepened, the sea grew calm, its surface smooth as glass. The last light caught the edge of the blue Wren model, now displayed inside the museum's window above the beach, gleaming softly like a star trapped in wood. Rex raised his head once, as if sensing something in the distance, a rhythm only dogs and sailors could hear. Then he laid it back down, eyes closing, content. Ethan stood in silence until the first stars appeared, the waves murmuring their endless hymn. Somewhere between the water and the wind, he thought he heard it. A faint voice carried through time, whispering not in words but in feeling, gratitude, peace, and the weightless release of a promise fulfilled. And for the first time in many years, Ethan felt the same. Sometimes miracles don't come as thunder or lightning. They come quietly. In the way an old promise is kept, and how a loyal dog guards a man's sleepless nights, or how the ocean, after years of silence, finally returns a truth it once hid. Ethan never called what happened a miracle, but maybe that's exactly what it was. Not the kind that splits seas or moves mountains, but the kind that moves hearts. Because somewhere between the salt and the wind, he found what many of us spend our lives searching for: peace, forgiveness, and purpose. And perhaps that is how God works. Not always through angels or shining lights, but through people like Ethan, through dogs like Rex, through every small act of love that makes the world whole again. Maybe God speaks through the sea too, in every wave that says, "You are not forgotten."